Good afternoon, students. Today is Wednesday, 7 April 2021. We are now about to start our second day on Kant. Now remember, there are two chapters in the book on Kant. Feldman entitles them Kant 1 and Kant 2. We're spending 4 days on the first of those two chapters and 2 days on the second. So a total of 6 days on Kant. And today is the second of those 6 days. Now we're currently working our way through chapter 7, which is entitled Kant 1. And I want to take you back to a particular page of Feldman where he quotes Kant. One of the maddening things about Kant is that he formulates his supreme principle of morality in different ways. In fact, at least 3 different ways. Chapter 7 is devoted to the first of the 3 ways. Chapter 8 covers the second and third formulations, and we're going to look only at the second formulation when we get to that chapter. We're just going to ignore the third formulation. So we're going to look at 2 of the 3 formulations. And right now we're looking at the first formulation. And guess what? Kant formulates the first formulation in different ways. Just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, look at page 99 of Feldman. This is from a translation of Kant into English by one of the great translators in philosophy. Here's the first of 4 statements by Kant. He says, "I ought never to act except in such a way that I can also will that my maxim should become a universal law." Notice the key elements of that statement. First of all, he says ought, right? So he's definitely making a moral judgment. Secondly, he mentions the word will, so it has something to do with willing or willpower. Third, he uses the word maxim. And finally, he uses the term universal law. And those terms are going to crop up over and over again. So let's take a look at the second formulation. Kant says, and again, I'm still reading from page 99. Kant says elsewhere, "Act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law." Once again, you have the word act, the word will, the word maxim, and the term universal law. Third, Kant says elsewhere, "Act as if the maxim of your action were to become, through your will, a universal law of nature." Again, the same basic elements are there. Act, maxim, will, and universal law. This time he added 2 words. He calls it universal law of nature. And finally, in a different place in his little book, Kant said, "We must be able to will that a maxim of our action should become a universal law. This is the general canon for all moral judgment of action." So it's pretty clear that to understand Kant's theory or supreme principle, you have to understand what he means by words like act or action. What does he mean by a maxim? What does he mean by will or willing? And what does he mean by universal law or universal law of nature? So what we're doing right now in this chapter, early in this chapter, is we're taking these terms one at a time and we're trying to figure out exactly what Kant meant by them. In some cases, it's still difficult to figure out what he meant. You can see that when you're reading Feldman. Feldman sometimes throws his hands up in frustration and says, it's just not clear what exactly Kant means by this. So we're going to have to do our best and try to make some sense of it. Now, in the previous lecture 2 days ago, I think it was 2 days ago, we discussed maxims. What is a maxim? And the best way to understand a maxim, I think, is in terms of a rule. Earlier, when we discussed rule utilitarianism, we saw that a rule is a conditional sentence, which means if, then. And we can understand a maxim in the same way. A maxim has the form if blank, then blank. The first blank is filled in with a certain situation, and the second blank is filled in with an action, with a prescription for an action. So here would be an example of a maxim. When I'm tired, or if I'm tired, then I shall sleep. Okay, so if you see me go into the bedroom and lie down, you may wonder what's going on, and you may say, Keith, excuse me, what are you doing? And I would think about it for a moment and say, I'm acting on a maxim. My maxim is, when I'm tired, I shall sleep. Or if I'm in a condition of being tired, then I shall retire to the bed and sleep. So the maxim is simply what you understand yourself to be doing at a particular time and place. Kant called a maxim a subjective principle of volition. So volition means will. So a maxim has something to do with the will. When I'm in a certain situation, I will to do the following act. I will to perform the following act. Now, the reason Kant called a maxim a subjective principle of volition rather than objective is because sometimes we may be mistaken about the situation we find ourselves in. If I think that I have no money in my bank account, then I may formulate the maxim, when I am broke, I shall ask someone for money. Now, in fact, I'm not broke. I'm assuming that I really do have money in my account. I've simply forgotten that I have it there. So much time has passed. Maybe for some reason I believe that I withdrew all the money, when in fact I left some money in the account. So that would still be my maxim. My maxim would still be, when I am broke, I shall borrow money from someone. So the maxim could be false in the sense that it does not correctly describe the situation you're in, but it does correctly describe the situation that you believe to be in. So do you see what I mean when what Kant means when he calls it a subjective principle of the will? And notice also that two people can perform the same action or set of actions with different maxims. That was the Grimbley and Hughes example. Remember the two grocers? Grimbley always gives correct change to his customers, but for a particular reason. He believes that if he gives correct change to his customers, it will build up goodwill and trust, and they will keep coming back to make further purchases, and he will make more money. So Grimbley's maxim is, whenever I can increase my profits, I shall give correct change to my customers. Hughes, a different grocer, also gives correct change to his customers, but he does it with a different maxim. Hughes isn't concerned for his financial well-being. He believes that giving correct change is required. He believes that it's his duty, even if it didn't increase his profits. So his maxim is something like, whenever a customer purchases something, I shall give him or her correct change. Notice no reference is made to profits or getting ahead. So Grimbley and Hughes both perform the same action or actions, which is giving their customers the correct change, but they do so under different descriptions or with different maxims. So the maxim is what's going on in your head when you're acting. That may be a helpful way to think of it. It's the subjective principle according to which you act. Now let's turn to the next concept, universal law. You'll notice in the 4 quotations that we just went over from Kant, he used the term universal law, and at least once he used the term universal law of nature. So what is that all about? Well, Feldman doesn't say a lot about this. He simply distinguishes between 2 types of universal laws and then stipulates that we're going to focus on only one of the 2. So what are the 2 universal laws? Kant says that there are universal laws of physics. Right? These are the laws that describe how the world works. The law of gravity, for example, the law of thermodynamics. Okay? These are physical laws, laws that describe the physical operations of the world or of the universe. But there's also this thing called a law of freedom, according to Kant. These are moral laws. They state moral necessities, not physical necessities, but moral necessities. So, having made that distinction between two types of universal law, let's just stipulate that we're going to focus on the universal law of nature rather than the moral version, because that's the one that Kant mentions from time to time in this book. Okay, we're going to use the term universal law to refer to universal laws of nature rather than to morality. Okay, let's turn now to the next important concept. It's the concept of willing. And there's a lot of obscurity here, unfortunately. So let me just say a few things about it. I'll try not to deviate from what Feldman says. The first point to notice is that willing is not identical to wishing or wanting. Right? So to will for something is not the same as to wish for it to happen. And you can see this because it makes perfectly good sense to wish for world peace, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to will world peace. And maybe the reason for that is when you will, there's an implication that you have some control over the situation. And if I have no control over whether there is world peace, then it makes no sense for me to say, I will that there be world peace. But that doesn't stop me from wishing for it, does it? Or hoping for it. I want there to be world peace. I wish there were world peace. I hope that one day there will be world peace. But it sounds odd to say, I will there to be world peace. Maybe God could will such a thing if there's a God. God has it within God's power to bring about things like world peace. So it is something that's within the scope of God's will. But no particular human, however powerful, has that power or that control. So the first point I want to make, and Feldman makes it as well, is that we shouldn't think of willing as wishing. The two concepts are related, but they're not identical. Okay, willing seems to be more than merely wishing or wanting. Okay, the second point is that, and I've just alluded to this, willing connotes some amount of control over the situation. Now, suppose I buy a lottery ticket. Again, I can hope to win the lottery. I may want to win the lottery. But it really sounds odd, doesn't it, to say, I will that I win the lottery, as though your will has any control over it or any influence on it. Surely it does not. So that would be an incorrect use of the word. You can't will to win the lottery. You can wish that you win the lottery and hope to win the lottery. You can want to win the lottery. So willing is an interesting concept because it connotes a certain degree of control, not necessarily total control, but some amount of control. Now here's the thing that must be understood in order to understand Kant. Kant repeatedly talks about inconsistent willing. And the opposite of that, of course, is consistent willing. So we need to make sure we understand this before we move on. What does it mean to inconsistently will something? Well, what it means is that you're willing two or more things that cannot be the case. Now, there are a lot of examples of this. Feldman gives one where I will that I move, and I also will that I remain motionless. If I were to will both of those states of affairs, I would be willing inconsistently. I can't consistently will both that I be in motion and that I remain motionless. Why? Because no object can be at the same time both in motion and without motion. You see that? Now, there's another aspect of it as well. Suppose I already will to be in motion. Suppose I currently will that. I cannot at some later point begin wishing to be motionless, as provided I continue to will to be in motion. Once again, at a particular time, I will to be in motion. Some later time, and at that later time, I'm still willing to be in motion, but now I will to be motionless. At that moment, I now am willing inconsistently. So there are two ways to will inconsistently. By willing two things at the same time that cannot both be the case, and by willing something now and then adding something else later to it that makes it inconsistent. Those would both be forms of inconsistent willing, according to Kant. Now, I thought of an example during my walk with my dogs a few minutes ago, a way that may help explain this. Imagine two great tennis players who are meeting in a championship match. Who are the great tennis players today on the male side? A man named Djokovic, I think, and someone named Rafael Nadal. And I know they've both won a lot of Grand Slam events. So imagine that Djokovic and Nadal are meeting in the final of some tennis tournament, let's say Wimbledon. We could call it a battle of the wills. Have you ever heard that term? A battle of the wills, because Nadal wills to win, and he has some degree of control over whether he wins, and Djokovic wills to win as well. Notice they cannot both win the match. So if one of them willed, suppose Djokovic willed both that he win the match and that Nadal, who may be his friend, will win the match. Okay? So Djokovic wills that he win the match, and because Nadal is his friend, suppose he wills that Nadal win the match. He is willing inconsistently because they cannot both win that match. They can win different matches, but they cannot both win that match. So that would be another example of inconsistent willing. You can will that you win, or you can will that the opponent wins, but you can't will that both of you win the match. So here's how Feldman puts it on page 103. Let's let him speak now. He says, in general, we can say that a person wills inconsistently if he wills that P be the case, some state of affairs P, and he wills that Q be the case, that's a different state of affairs, call it Q, and it's impossible, either logically or physically, and I'm adding those words, for P and Q to be the case together. So that's what it means to will inconsistently. It means you're willing P and you're willing Q, and it's impossible for both P and Q to be the case together. And there are two forms of impossibility. Sometimes two things can't be the case because it's logically impossible for them to be the case. At other times, it's logically possible for the two things to be the case, but it's physically impossible. So we have two kinds of possibility and impossibility, physical and logical. And it's safe to say that either one of those would suffice for Kant to make for inconsistent willing. You can will inconsistently either because the two things you're willing are physically impossible together or because they're logically impossible together. Okay? Either one of those types of impossibility would make for inconsistent willing. So the moral of the story in general is it's okay to will things, but don't will two or more things that cannot exist together. Because if you do, you're willing inconsistently. And that's a form of irrationality, isn't it? Isn't it irrational to will two things that cannot both exist at the same time? And isn't it just as irrational to believe two things that can't both be true? Imagine that I formed the following beliefs. Suppose I believe that all bachelors are unmarried. Let me say that again. Suppose I form the belief that all bachelors are unmarried. Suppose at some later point, while still believing that, I form an additional belief that some bachelors are married. At that moment, I now have two beliefs. All bachelors are unmarried and some bachelors are married. Those two beliefs cannot both be true. It's logically impossible for both of those propositions to be true. And therefore, anybody who believes both of those propositions at the same time is irrational. That person is believing inconsistently. Okay? So willing inconsistently is analogous to believing inconsistently. And the moral of the story is, if you want to be rational, you shouldn't do either one of those. Don't believe inconsistent propositions and don't will inconsistent states of affairs. Okay? Don't will two things when they can't both exist. That's irrational. And you'll see as we go along, this is the crucial concept for Kant because he defines right and wrong in terms of your ability to will consistently. If you can will consistently, he would say your action is right. If you cannot will consistently, your action is wrong. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let's turn now to the next section of the chapter, and this is the only other section I want to cover today. What remains after today for the final two lectures on this chapter will be the section entitled Kant's Four Examples. And we're going to spend 2 whole days going over Kant's examples slowly and carefully. And that reminds me to tell you that I've now posted some items for you on Canvas to help you understand Kant. Here's what I've posted so far. I posted a handout called, you can see it's a flow chart. It's entitled First Formulation of Kant's Categorical Imperative. Earlier today I told you that Kant has 3 different formulations. We're currently discussing the first one, and that's what this handout has to do with. Now, by the way, I revised this handout. I posted it, I think, yesterday, and now today I have replaced it with one that I call revised version. So make sure that if you printed this handout out, make sure you go back and get the correct one. The first one was dated 5 April. I guess it was 2 days ago when I posted it. This one, the revised version, is dated 7 April, which is today. So sorry about that. I just tinkered with the wording, but I think it's important that we be looking at the same handout. So print this one. If you printed the other one out already, dispose of it, recycle it, and make sure this is the one you look at from now on. Okay? So this is the first handout that's posted. It says revised version on Canvas very clearly. So that's the one you want. And I deleted the first one. So if you didn't already print it out, the only one that's left is the correct one, the revised one. I've also posted a handout entitled Applying Kant's Categorical Imperative. And it's 4 pages long. So make sure you print that. We're going to start going over that next week. And we're going to go over it on both days next week. Okay, there's a lot contained in that handout. It's my attempt to summarize the examples that Feldman discusses in this section of the book. Okay, so 2 things are posted. There will be a couple of other postings in due course, maybe over the weekend. I'll put up a third. In fact, in the next couple days, for sure, I'll be posting a handout called Kant's 4 Examples. So let's turn to the section of the chapter entitled The Categorical Imperative. Remember, Kant is searching for what he calls the supreme principle of morality. And he thinks he's found it. And he gives it a name. Kant calls the supreme principle of morality the categorical imperative. And it's usually written with capital letters. Categorical with a capital letter C, imperative with a capital letter I. So he's got a name for his theory. Remember Jeremy Bentham? Jeremy Bentham called his theory the principle of utility. And other people like John Stuart Mill called it utilitarianism. So different theorists give different names to their theories. Kant happened to call his the categorical imperative. Now, let me just explain a little bit about that title. An imperative is a command or directive. So if I say to you, close the door, or close the door, please, I'm issuing an imperative. What that means is I'm trying to get you to do something. Okay? I'm commanding or requesting or directing you to do something. According to Kant, there are two types of imperative. Some of them he calls hypothetical, and others he calls categorical. Now, let me explain the difference in this way. A hypothetical imperative always has a condition attached to it. So it might be called a conditional imperative, but Kant calls it hypothetical. Here's an example. If you want a good grade in this course, then you should study hard. Notice, that's an if-then sentence, isn't it? It's a conditional. It has an if part, the antecedent, which says you want a good grade, and it has a consequent, which is the then part, and that is you should study hard. So that would be a hypothetical imperative. Notice, it applies or directs itself only to people who want a good grade. If for some strange reason you don't care what grade you get in this course, then you would just ignore that advice, right? That advice is directed to people who want a good grade. It says, if you want a good grade in this course, then you should do the following, namely, study hard or study well. So Kant said there are all kinds of hypothetical imperatives. If you want a good yield of crops this year, then you should fertilize them and make sure they get ample water or the appropriate amount of water. If your car is not running well, then you should take it to a mechanic. Okay, all kinds of advice like this would constitute a hypothetical imperative. Categorical imperatives, according to Kant, are very different. They're unconditional. They have no conditions attached to them, such as if you want a good grade in this course. And Kant believed that morality is a collection of categorical imperatives. So the basic form of morality is do X, period, or don't do X, period. Right? Morality never says, if you want to do the right thing, then do such and such. Or if you want to be happy, then you should do such and such. It doesn't say, if you want to be successful or rich, then you should do such and such. All of those would be hypothetical imperatives. What morality says is, keep your promises, period. Tell the truth, period. Don't lie, don't kill, don't steal, and so on. Morality is a collection of categorical imperatives, right? It's not a collection of hypothetical imperatives. That has to do with prudence. Prudence is doing what's in your best interest. And so if you want a good grade in the class, it's in your interest to study hard. If you want a good yield on your crops, then you should fertilize them and see that they get adequate water and sunlight and so on. So morality according to Kant, is fundamentally different from prudence. Prudence is about self-interest. Morality is about doing things or refraining from doing things, whether they're in your interest or not. So if I were to tell somebody, keep your promises, what I'm saying, according to Kant, is keep your promises. No ifs, ands, or buts. Keep your promises means keep your promises, period, whether you want to or not. So morality for Kant is very stern. It's categorical, right? Keep all of your promises. Don't just keep certain promises, those that you want to keep or those that you think will promote your interest. You must keep all of your promises, whether it's in your interest or not. So I hope you can see why Kant called his theory the categorical imperative with capital letters. It's because in his view, morality is the set or collection of categorical imperatives with small c and small I. Okay? Morality is not a collection of hypothetical imperatives. So let's take a look at Feldman's formulation of Kant's categorical imperative. He actually goes through a series of formulations and then settles upon one of them as the correct one. I'm going to read the one that Feldman ends up settling on as the correct formulation of Kant's theory. He calls it Ci sub 1. Remember we had U sub 7? That was the correct and final formulation of act utilitarianism. Later we had E sub 1. That was the correct formulation of ethical egoism. Now we have Ci sub 1, and it turns out to be the correct formulation of Kant's theory, according to Feldman. So here we go. This is from page 104 of Feldman. Ci sub 1 says, quote, an act is morally right if and only if. Now let me stop right there. So far it sounds familiar, doesn't it? Because with every theory we've looked at so far, act utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism, egoism, they all start out the same way. An act is right if and only if blank. They fill in the blank differently. Of course, that's what makes them different theories. So let's fill in the blank for this theory. I'm going to repeat it from the beginning. An act is morally right if and only if the agent, remember that's just the person performing the act, the agent of the act can, consistently will, and now you know what that means, that the generalized form of the maxim of the act be a law of nature. Now, the other day, 2 days ago, we discussed what a maxim is and what a generalized form of a maxim is. So let me just do a quick review because that term came up in this statement of the theory, generalized form of the maxim of the act. Suppose my maxim is, when I'm tired, I shall sleep. Notice that makes reference to me, Keith. When I, Keith, am tired, I, Keith, shall sleep. That's my maxim. I can always generalize whatever maxim I have and make it applicable to anyone, not just to me. And so in this case, it might be something like this. Whenever anyone is tired, he or she shall sleep. Notice it no longer makes reference to me, Keith. I'm included, right, because it says whenever anyone, and I'm part of anyone, but it's not limited to me any longer. So think of the generalized form of the maxim as the form that applies generally. Right? That's why we call it a generalized form. It applies generally, not to anybody in particular, such as me. So once again, let's read this over again because all of the parts are now in place to help you understand this. Kant says an act is morally right if and only if the following. The agent of that act can, consistently will, and now you know what that means, that the generalized form of the maxim of the act be a law of nature. or you might say a universal law of nature, because sometimes Kant uses that whole phrase. So the basic idea is this. Kant said you shouldn't do something unless you can will that everyone in your situation do it. If you can't will that everyone do what you're proposing to do, then you shouldn't do it either. It would be wrong of you to do it. After all, you're no exception to the rule. You may think you're more important than others, but in reality, you're not. You're one among many, and every one of you counts, every one of you matters, every one of you is equally important. So don't make exceptions for yourself. That seems to be what really is driving Kant. Kant said that as long as you guide yourself by this notion that you're not special, you will act rightly. Perform only those actions that you can will everyone perform. And if you can't will that everyone do what you're thinking of doing, then you shouldn't do it either. And it would be wrong and contrary to your duty if you were to do it. So I hope you're starting to see what's driving Kant. He's trying to formulate a universal rule that everyone can follow. And he wants us to be able to think in those terms. Before I act, I should ask myself, what if everybody did this? Can I will that? Would I want that? Okay, the next thing Feldman does is he introduces a definition. He introduces a term that's long and perhaps ugly. The term is universalizable. Universalizable. Now, think about the basic form of that word. What if I said to you that a particular mountain is climbable? What does that mean? Well, it means capable of being climbed. A mountain is climbable when it is capable of being climbed. That doesn't mean that someone has already climbed it, but if someone did, it could be climbed, right? Climbable means capable of being climbed. Well, universalizable means capable of being universalized. And what does that mean? It means capable of being made into a universal law or a universal law of nature. So the term universalizable, as well as the term universalizability, refers to the capacity of a maxim to be universally applied or to be universal. So here's the definition that Kant gives on page 104. He says a maxim is universalizable, if and only if the agent who acts upon it can consistently will that its generalized form be a law of nature. So what sorts of things are universalizable? Maxims. A given maxim is either universalizable or it's not. What would it mean? Let's take those one at a time. What would it mean to say that a given maxim is universalizable? It would mean that the agent can consistently will that the generalized form of that maxim be a universal law of nature. Now, what would it mean if we said that a particular maxim is not universalizable or capable of being universalized? What that means is that the agent cannot consistently will that the generalized form of the maxim be a universal law of nature. So we can, if we wish, use the term universalizable. It'll spare us a lot of words in understanding Kant's theory. If we put the definition that we just gave of the word universalizable, if we put that together with Ci sub 1, we get the following. Feldman calls it Ci sub 1 prime. Okay, and you can see this. In case you're wondering what I mean by prime, let's go to page 104, and you'll notice on near the top of the page, go to the very top of the page. You see Ci sub 1. Okay, that's the one we went over already. Down below, you see CI1 prime. Okay, and the definition is in between those two. You see where Feldman writes, we can say that a maxim is universalizable if and only if the agent, blah, blah, blah. So CI sub 1 combined with the definition of the word universalizable gives us CI sub 1 prime. The prime is like an apostrophe. All right. Later on the page, there's a double prime and a triple prime, but ignore them for the moment. Look at CI sub 1 prime. It goes like this. An act is morally right if and only if its maxim is universalizable. So notice, we cut a lot of words out of the statement of the theory by inserting the definition of the word universalizable. If you want, you can think of Kant's theory as saying simply this. An act is right if and only if its maxim is universalizable. What does that mean? It means an act is right if and only if the agent can consistently will that the generalized form of the maxim of the act be a universal law of nature. Now that's a mouthful, isn't it? That's a lot of words. And we can get rid of them and replace them with that one word. An act is right if and only if its maxim is universalizable. All right, so we could use either, from now on in this chapter, when we discuss Kant's theory, we can use either of the two formulations, CI sub 1, which is long-winded, or CI sub 1 prime, which is shorter and sweeter, because it replaces a lot of words with the one word, universalizable. Okay, so we now have a formulation of Kant's theory. On page 104, Feldman discusses some complications. And here are a couple of them that I want to mention. Some people have claimed when they read Kant, they interpret him differently. Some people say that Kant is giving only a necessary condition for rightness. Feldman disagrees. Feldman says, I've read Kant myself, and I think he's giving both a necessary condition for rightness and a sufficient condition for rightness. So Feldman thinks it should be if and only if. The other people I mentioned think it should be only if. They say an act is right only if blah, blah, blah. Feldman says, no, if you read Kant carefully, he seems to be providing us with a criterion of rightness. Remember that word? A criterion is a statement of necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be the case. So Feldman disagrees with people who say that Kant was providing only a necessary condition. Feldman says, yes, he was doing that, but he was also providing us with a sufficient condition. And notice that Feldman's interpretation has a virtue, and that is that it makes Kant's theory a rival of other normative ethical theories like act utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism, egoism, and many others. Why does it make it a rival of them? Because those theories, as you know, all are stated as if and only if. Act utilitarianism, U sub 7, states a criterion of rightness. So does rule utilitarianism. So does egoism. So one reason to interpret Kant as giving both a necessary and a sufficient condition for moral rightness is that it allows his theory to be a direct competitor to these other theories, a rival of those other theories. Okay? We want them to be all on a par with one another, right? And this allows that. One other thing Feldman discusses, I'll just mention it, is that some people think that Kant wasn't giving a criterion of rightness for actions. He was giving a criterion of acceptability of maxims. Okay, now where does Feldman discuss this? Let me direct your attention to page 104, I believe it is. flipping through my notes here, or through the text. Look at the bottom of page 104. It's called CI sub 1 triple prime. Some people think that Kant is best interpreted as saying the following: a maxim is morally acceptable if and only if it is universalizable. Notice how that differs from CI sub 1. CI sub 1 has to do with the rightness of an act. This has to do with the acceptability of a maxim. Very different. Now, Feldman goes on to say, and I won't belabor it here, Feldman goes on to say that there's textual evidence against this interpretation of Kant. When you read what Kant actually wrote, this is implausible. Kant speaks often of acts being in accordance with duty or contrary to duty. Acts. So Kant did care very much about the rightness or wrongness of acts. He wasn't just concerned with the acceptability or unacceptability of maxims. Yes, he does have a concept of a maxim. Every act has a maxim, but that doesn't mean Kant was concerned only with the acceptability of maxims. He's ultimately concerned with the rightness or wrongness of actions, although he referred to it as being in accordance with duty or being contrary to duty. So when Kant said that a particular act is in accordance with duty, he means it's right. It's a right act. When he said that an act is contrary to duty, he's obviously saying it's wrong. So just because Kant didn't use the terms right and wrong doesn't mean he wasn't thinking in those terms. He used a different terminology: in accordance with duty, contrary to duty. Okay, and we can interpret them as right and wrong, respectively. Okay, let's end today by going over this handout. This is a flow chart, and it has up here, see this, whoops, right there, this box or rectangle. Here is my quotation of Kant, at least a translation of Kant, and this flow chart in gray is designed to help you understand how to work your way through Kant's theory. So if you have not yet printed this, go do it now. Pause the video, go print this so you can look at it with me as we go over it together. And remember, you want the one dated 7 April up here. It's called Revised Version on Canvas. Okay, now I assume you've gone and printed it and have it in front of you. Here is Kant speaking. Actually, Kant wrote this in German, and it's been translated by H.J. Paton, P-A-T-O-N, one of the great translators of Kant. Okay, there have been many. He's considered one of the great ones. In 1964, when this volume was published, here's H.J. Paton's translation of Kant's German into English. He says, "Act only on that maxim through which you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law." So that's the first formulation of Kant's categorical imperative. Now, here's how you would apply it in practice. Go to the left of this handout over here and work your way to the right. Here's the first question you should ask if you're trying to do the right thing in accordance with Kant's theory. First question: is the generalized form of the maxim of the act capable of being a universal law? Now, suppose you're thinking of performing a certain act, right? Maybe you're tempted to do something, but before you do it, you want to think it through and make sure it's the right thing to do. The first question you should ask yourself is the generalized form of the maxim of my act, the one I'm thinking of performing, capable of being a universal law or a universal law of nature? Notice that's a yes or no question. And if you move to the right, if you go from here over here, you'll see two branches, one with a yes answer to that question, one with a no answer. So let's begin with the no answer because that will end the discussion. Suppose the answer to the first question is no. The generalized form of the maxim of my act, my proposed act, is not capable of being a universal law of nature. If the answer to that question is no, then the act is wrong. And by wrong, I mean contrary to duty. That's the way Kant would put it. And he gives two examples of this that we're going to discuss next week in the third lecture on Kant. He gives an example of a man who's considering killing himself, and he gives the example of a man or a person who is thinking about making a lying promise, making a promise to someone that he knows he can't keep because he's broke. Okay? So we're going to see two examples of a no answer in our next lecture. What if the answer to that first question is yes? What if the generalized form of the maxim of the act is capable of being a universal law of nature? Now we need to ask a second question before we know whether the act is right or wrong. So look at the box headed with the word yes, and look at the second question. The second question is, can you, the agent, consistently will that the generalized form of the maxim of the act be a universal law? And if we want to replace all those words with the word universalizable, we could simply ask, can you, the agent, consistently will that the maxim be universalized? In other words, is the maxim universalizable? Is it capable of being willed by you to be a universal law of nature? And that as well is a yes or no question. What if the answer to that question is no? You see the box for that down here? If the answer to that question is no, once again, the act turns out to be wrong, contrary to duty. Two of Kant's four examples fall into this category. They involve a person who decides not to develop his talents, right? He lets his talents rust. And the other one refuses to give money to charity. The second person decides to give nothing to charity, to help people who are in need. Even though he or she is able to help them, he or she chooses not to. So Kant is going to give four examples. Two of the four are in this box. The other two are in this one. So what that shows is that Kant thinks all four actions are wrong, but they're wrong for different reasons. Two of them are wrong for this reason. The other two are wrong for some other reason. Okay, for the sake of completeness, let's go to this box, which we haven't discussed yet. This is where the answer to this question is yes. So now we've answered both questions yes. Yes, the generalized form of the maxim can be a universal law of nature. And secondly, the agent can consistently will that it be a law of nature. So the maxim is universalizable, capable of being universalized. In that case, the answer is yes. The agent, when the answer is yes, the agent can consistently will it. The act is right, according to Kant, meaning in accordance with duty. Okay, and here would be an example of that. This one is not discussed by Kant, but there have to be examples of right actions. This would be borrowing money with the intention of repaying it. Right? That can be willed, consistently willed to be a universal law of nature. Suppose I need money and I know that in 1 week I'll be able to repay it. I'm wondering whether I can make a promise to somebody. If you give me some money today, I will repay you in 1 week when I get my paycheck. Question, is that right? Making a promise like that? Well, the question for Kant is, can you consistently will that the generalized form of your maxim be a universal law of nature? And the answer is pretty clearly yes. I can consistently will that whenever people need money and have the intention to repay it, they borrow it with the promise to repay it. Right? There's nothing that prevents that from being consistently willable. So there are three outcomes on this flow chart. Here, where the answer is no to the first question. Here, where the answer is yes to the first question and no to the second question. And here, where the answer to both questions is yes. So think of it this way. It's a two-pronged test for rightness, according to Kant. Only if both questions are answered in the affirmative is the action right. If either of the two questions is answered in the negative, the act is wrong. And you have to know the two questions. The first question has to do not with what can be willed, but with what can be the case. Can the generalized form of the maxim be a law of nature? Yes or no? The second question has to do with will. Can the agent consistently will that the generalized form of the maxim of the act be a universal law of nature? It's two different questions. And according to Kant, both questions must be answered in the affirmative in order for the act to be right, meaning in accordance with duty. So I prepared this handout to you. It conforms exactly to Feldman, so there should be no confusion whatsoever. In fact, that's why I put up a revised version. My initial version left out a word here and there, and I decided, no, I don't want to confuse my students. I want to make it exactly tailored to Feldman. Even if I think that it's easier to state in a different way, I want to avoid confusing you. So that's why I put up a revised version. Okay? Maybe Feldman should have done something like this in his book, just to help the reader understand. But my job as your teacher is to act as a go-between between Feldman and you. Right? When I read Feldman, I think to myself, I could explain that a little bit better for my students. A particular diagram might be helpful to help my students understand that. So my job is intermediary or go-between. So I hope you take these handouts seriously. They're all designed to help you understand the book and my lectures. Okay, I think that's enough for today. We're almost 1 hour in. We have 2 more days on chapter 7. And in those 2 days, I'm going to focus exclusively on the section entitled Kant's 4 Examples. And I'm going to post today or tomorrow another handout on Canvas in which I actually quote Kant from his little book, because Feldman doesn't quote him at much length. And I want to give you the full statement of what Kant said so you can see the full context. And maybe we should divide this up into 2 examples on the 3rd lecture next week and the other 2 examples on the 4th lecture. Okay, there are 4 examples. Let's divide it up. 2, can't do this. 2, and then the other 2. Okay, so we'll see how long that takes. It might take over an hour. Maybe it'll take 45 minutes. But whatever. We'll spend the next class period on 2 examples and the 4th one on the final 2 examples. Well, have a great day and a nice weekend. Keep checking on Canvas for that next handout that I will put up over the weekend. And I'll see you on the video screen next week on the computer screen.